Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It explores how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. It looks at how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
I would define vulnerability, Aga, this way. Vulnerability is exposure to the possibility of risk or harm. That's my definition. It's exposure to the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility. And then when we say risk or harm, what do we mean? In an organization, in a social setting, risk or harm comes in several different categories. It could be social, mental, psychological. It could also be physical because your physical well-being is connected to those other domains. It could also be political or economic. And so you could suffer, you could go through loss or harm in those categories. And what we're saying is that vulnerability is exposing yourself to the possibility that could happen.
Welcome to episode 79 of the Culture Lab podcast. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind global community for leaders and culture champions who want to learn new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures at scale in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. The CultureBrained Community is where we come together to answer some pretty darn hard, ungoogleable questions about culture. And our members get to participate in things like weekly huddles, masterclasses, flash mastermind groups, and talks from world-class experts on culture. And you know many of these experts from this podcast. But most importantly, we facilitate deep peer-to-peer connections because making work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, it's definitely not a task for a single person. It requires tapping into the collective wisdom of bold, kind, and curious culture leaders who are on a mission to redefine and, frankly, decrapify work. So if this sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, check it out at tiny.one/CultureBrained. And don't worry, you don't have to write it down. There is a link in the show notes. And now, let me introduce my guest today. So, if you told me, hey, Aga, I'm sold on the importance of psychological safety, but who would you recommend as the number one expert with actionable insights on how to create it? So, if you asked me that, I'd have to say Tim Clark. And frankly, Tim has been on my guest bucket list for a while for exactly this reason, but also because of the incredible depth of insights on this topic and his unique ability to simplify things without dumbing them down. So Tim is a recognized global authority in the fields of senior executive development, strategy acceleration, and organizational change. He's also the author of 5 books, including The 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, which is really a wonderful hands-on guide that shows us how we can build psychological safety in our teams and in our organizations. So the members of the CultureBrained community will also have an opportunity to participate in a live interactive session where we will do a deep dive on the do's and don'ts of building a psychologically safe company culture. So, without further ado, here is Tim Clark.
My name is Tim Clark, and I founded a boutique consulting and assessment firm that's called Leader Factor. We're based in the United States in the Salt Lake City area. We've been going for about 15 years, and we work with organizations literally around the world and across industries and across sectors. So nonprofits and government agencies and educational institutions, and of course, a lot of different companies. But It's the broad sweep of the client base that I love the most. And I think that gives us a global perspective on what we're doing. And we focus on transformation, primarily cultural transformation, but also other types of organizational transformation. So what does that mean? That means when an organization needs something beyond incremental change, when incremental change is not going to get it done, when you need what we call in the research literature a nonlinear step change, you need a fundamental shift and redirection in the organization. So that's what we focus on, and that's what I studied when I was in graduate school, and so that's what we've been doing.
That sounds fascinating. And I'm so happy to hear that you've been working with customers around the globe, because this is our audience as well. We have a global audience. And so it's wonderful to have that diverse perspective from you. And I'm really keen to dive straight into the topic of your work and your book. But before we do that, I ask one question to all our guests. And it's a question about the early cultural influences in your life. So the things that shaped you, and, how did you grow up, and what sort of impact did it have on you later on in life?
Well, I'm happy to answer that question. My upbringing, I think, was pretty diverse. My early childhood, I lived in southern Colorado among the Navajo. My father was a teacher among the Navajo, and they represent the second largest Native American tribe to the Cherokee. And so, as you can imagine, that was a culturally rich experience and quite distinctive. And then from there, we moved to LA.
Wow.
So think about that contrast. So we go from a Native American environment to Los Angeles, and we moved into a very diverse neighborhood where even just on our street, we had people from all over the world. I'm taking you on a geographic journey here, Aga.
What was it like for you to have that happen in your life? How old were you?
So in grade school, we moved to LA. We were there for a few years, and then we moved up to the Bay Area. That was very similar, except the ethnic mix was different. When we got to the Bay Area, my neighborhood was a lot of Asians. That introduced the Asian influence, which was fantastic. And then my parents moved back to Utah. Then in my adult life, well, let me sketch it a little bit more. So I took a football scholarship out of high school to play at Brigham Young University. And so the cultural environment of what we call Division I football in the United States is an environment that combines, it's a very interesting ethnic mix. So you have your white players, you have your African American players, and then you have a large contingent of Polynesian players. It was the confluence of those three streams, an incredible opportunity and experience there. After that, I served as a Christian missionary for the LDS Church in Seoul, Korea. So then I was off to Korea.
Wow.
And I learned the Korean language, and I worked. It was a completely immersive experience. I worked both in the middle of Seoul as well as out in the rice paddies by the Sea of Japan on the coast. So both rural and urban. And then, as you can imagine, everything was different in terms of culture, language, food, just a complete immersion. Came back, finished college, got married, moved out to Washington, D.C., and then went over to Oxford University in England for a PhD, and then circled back to the United States. So that's a little bit about my tour of duty, Aga. So maybe that helps a little bit.
I love that. Oh, my goodness.
So it has not been a homogenous experience.
I'm curious, because you've just scanned your life. When you have a look back, just sharing this with me right now, what stands out for you in terms of the thing that left the biggest imprint on you?
I think my response to that question, Aga, would be that, so you're exposed to, and you use these words at the outset, you're exposed to all kinds of demographics and psychographics. And that's wonderful. And we learn a lot about different demographics and psychographics and the profile of different people. I think the most important lesson that I extract from all of those experiences is that the human family is the most important thing. And this goes back to what I've learned about psychological safety as well. The human family has to be the highest loyalty, not human characteristics. If you get that mixed up, you're in trouble. You will immediately begin to sow the seeds of division. And so we have to elevate the human family as the highest loyalty and subordinate all of the other demographic and psychographic and cultural attributes, all those other differences. Those are wonderful. That brings the richness and the variety of life. And we celebrate those things and we value those things, but we do not elevate those things to be higher in importance to the human family and membership into that human family. Can I give you an example?
Absolutely. I'd love to hear an example.
A lot of people wonder, they're striving to create a deeply inclusive environment, and they have a hard time. And we see around the world that organizations are pursuing diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. They're trying. And in many cases, they're making great strides. They're making progress. But in many cases, they're hitting the wall. And they're not able to sustain that journey. And I think a big obstacle is that they're not putting in place this fundamental principle of humanity first. So I'll give you an example. In 1869, the great social reformer Frederick Douglass, he gave a speech in Boston. It's called The Composite Nation. And for all of those who are listening, you may want to go back and read this speech. It's remarkable.
We'll post the link in the show notes for everyone who's interested.
In that speech, he made a statement, and here's the statement. He said, "I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity." Now, what's the logic? What is he saying? What is race? Race is a human characteristic. It's a demographic. And there are a lot of other demographics. What he's saying is that a demographic attribute or characteristic cannot be elevated above humanity. Humanity comes first. Now, here's the interesting thing, Aga. When he was giving this speech in Boston in 1869, here he is, a great African-American social reformer. What was he doing? He was advocating for the citizenship rights of Chinese immigrants.
It is amazing.
Isn't that amazing? In 1869. He understood the governing principle of inclusion. And that's really it. And so the way that I articulate that in the book is that worth precedes worthiness. When it comes to building a deeply inclusive culture, organization, team, we should be applying a worth test to each other based on our common humanity, not a worthiness test based on our opinion of whether you're worthy or not based on demographics and psychographics. It always breaks down if you do that, and it's not legitimate. There are no grounds to justify exclusion based on demographics and psychographics. The only justifiable exclusion is the threat of harm. Otherwise, those demographics and psychographics, when it comes to inclusion, we have to say that they're arbitrary distinctions. Now, they're very important attributes of identity, but when it comes to inclusion, they're arbitrary distinctions. We can't make judgments based on those.
I'm really looking forward to learning from you right now, because I have to say, I love this principle. And fundamentally, obviously, I agree. And at the same time, I struggle to translate that into our organizations and how that could work. Because it seems to me that we're excluding people based on criteria that seem important, like, are you suited for the job? Are you qualified? Do you align with our values? Do you believe in the same things that we do? And it feels to me that without exclusion, there is no belonging. But I'm sure that I'm making a a mistake somewhere there. So I'd really love your help to help me figure that out. And I'm sure that it's going to be super helpful for our listeners as well.
That takes us back, Aga, to the 4 stages of psychological safety, which is the title of my recent book. It encapsulates the conceptual framework that I have identified based on empirical research. Well, first of all, let's step back and let's ask, what is culture and what is psychological safety, and what do the two have to do with each other? So let's begin with culture. Culture is to humans what water is to fish. So let me define it in a very simple way. We could look at a bunch of different social science disciplines and we could pull out long clinical definitions, but it's not going to be very helpful. The definition that I like best is that culture is 4 words: the way we interact. That's it, the way we interact. The reason I define it that way is that people will say, well, Tim, hang on a second. Culture includes values and norms and attitudes and beliefs and assumptions and all of these things. And my response is, you're right. But to use an adage, all of those things come out in the wash. In other words, when it comes to human interaction, they all come out. They're all reflected in the way that we interact. Everything. It comes out. And so you can say, for example, every organization has a culture. Every organization has values. Now, sometimes organizations, they put their values on the wall. They advertise, they publish their values, they put them behind glass. That's interesting. The question is, those are professed values. Are they the de facto values of the team or the organization? Don't know.
Let's say that they are. Let's take this case where you really have an organization that has done a lot of work to create congruence, and they have 3 values and they truly strongly believe in them and stand by them and use them as a compass to manage their business, lead their people, etc., etc.
Okay.
And so my next step in circling back to my earlier question would be, well, if that's the case, so you really have these principles that guide you, aren't you going to look for people who are aligned with that and who don't violate those beliefs that are so important for your organization?
So those will become selection criteria for bringing people into the organization. You're not talking about society here. You're talking about an organization that you have built by design.
Mm-hmm.
And so you are fully entitled to try to find people who embrace and reflect the values that you're talking about. As I said before, if culture is the way we interact, then those 3 values that you just mentioned, Aga, those will be reflected at the interface, at the human interface. They will be reflected in the behavior of the people. Let's go to the next step. The next step is, what is psychological safety? So this is a term that came into the research literature in 1965 when Warren Bennis and Edgar Schein at MIT wrote a book called Organizational Change Through Group and Individual Methods. They put a paragraph in the book about psychological safety. Earlier mentions of the term came in the 1940s in physical safety manuals, but the term was not developed. And we were using other language and other terms to get at what we meant. So there was this consolidation around the term psychological safety that took several decades to happen. And there are various definitions that you can find in the research literature, but here's mine. Mine is a 5-word definition. Psychological safety is an environment of rewarded vulnerability. You have to think about that for a minute. The reason it is that is because in order to be yourself, you need an environment of rewarded vulnerability.
I love that definition, by the way, fully aligned. So let's unpack it a little bit. What do you mean by vulnerability? I guess we need to define that, right?
Sure.
and then rewarded. I have read your book, so I'm very familiar, but I want to be sure that our listeners can follow us in the conversation because this is so important. And I actually recently had a conversation, public conversation on LinkedIn about that issue. And I realized that people are not necessarily aware of what we mean when we talk about vulnerability.
Okay. Well, let's clarify that. And thank you for pulling us back here. I would define vulnerability, Aga, this way. Vulnerability is exposure to the possibility of risk or harm.
Mm-hmm.
That's my definition. It's exposure to the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility. And then when we say risk or harm, what do we mean? In an organization, in a social setting, risk or harm comes in several different categories. It could be social, mental, psychological. It could also be physical because your physical well-being is connected to those other domains. It could also be political or economic. And so you could suffer, you could go through loss or harm in those categories. And what we're saying is that vulnerability is exposing yourself to the possibility that that could happen.
I think this is where the big misunderstanding happens, because for a lot of people, when they think about the definition of vulnerability, they think about that piece around being helpless or not strong enough or whatever. But you are saying is, to the contrary, it's actually an act of courage when you go to the core of it, because to open yourself to the risk of being harmed means basically being bold and courageous.
That's right.
And in the workplace, I can imagine it can take many different forms. Obviously, one of them would be, if you are my boss and you are just about to make a decision that is based on data that hasn't been verified, for example, do I raise that issue? Do I expose myself to that risk of something negative happening to me, or just being uncomfortable or being shut down or whatever? Do I feel safe enough to do that, right?
Right. Well, you hit it on the head, Aga. So we said the risk of harm is also the risk of possibility.
Mm-hmm.
It's also the risk of potential. And so you have to go out and you have to venture because that's how we have to take risks in order to grow, in order to accomplish something meaningful. And so there has to be exposure.
There has to be a name for that place. I envision now, I have it in front of my eyes. It's like a tiny spot where you have to leap somehow, somewhere.
You do. There's never been, there never will be certainty in that space. It's that space that occupies both the potential for the risk or the harm, but also the potential for achievement, for potential for all kinds of reward. So what I'm saying is you have to go there. So that's the definition of psychological safety. It's an environment of rewarded vulnerability on several levels. Let's begin with the individual. So your vulnerability can be either rewarded or punished. So if we're talking about inclusion, right, you've been in social settings, I have, we all have, where being yourself is expensive.
Yeah.
What that means is that there's the certainty of some kind of harm or loss in that environment.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to take a hit. You're going to experience some harm or loss. So if you're in that kind of environment, that's not inclusive. But it goes beyond that. When humans interact in social units and social collectives of any kind, they engage in different kinds of vulnerable behavior. And so one of those is connecting with each other. We are biologically, spiritually, socially, we're driven to connect. And so we want to do that. So that's vulnerable activity. That's vulnerable behavior. It could be rewarded or punished. So that's one category of vulnerable activity. Another one is learning. Another one is contributing or adding value. And then the last one is improving, which you can only improve by challenging. And so challenging behavior, it's kind of the last category of vulnerable behavior. Those categories of vulnerable behavior correspond to what I call the 4 stages of psychological safety. Maybe we could go into that a little bit, should we?
Yeah, I'd love that. So inclusion safety, learner safety, contribution safety, and challenger safety. Absolutely, let's go in and have a deeper look at each of them. I think what I'm particularly interested in is, do you need to achieve inclusion safety first before you can go to learner safety and so on? Does it work this way? Or, well, talk to us a little bit first about deeper what each of them are, and then how do you cultivate each of them?
Let's do it. First of all, let me back up a little bit, Aga. Let me share with all of your listeners the question that I asked myself years ago. So I've been reading through the research literature in psychological safety from the beginning. And the question that kept coming to my mind and the issue that kept bothering me was, well, hang on a second. Psychological safety is not a binary proposition. It's not something that you have or don't have. It's a matter of degree. You might have very little. You might have quite a lot. Well, if that's true, if it's not a binary proposition, then it logically follows there must be a pattern in the way that it increases. It's not going to be arbitrary. There's going to be an empirical pattern in the way that it builds, the way that it increases. And so that was the research question that I've had in my mind for several years, and that led me to jump into this and then to write the book. So here's what I found. There is a pattern. It is a linear progression. Now, in reality, it's pretty messy. It's not as clean and tidy as we would like to imagine.
Yeah, I can imagine. The reality is always messier than, than our ideas on paper.
That's true. But the linear progression is still there. It's clear. So it works this way. Psychological safety moves through 4 successive stages. Stage 1 is what we call inclusion safety. Inclusion safety is the foundation of psychological safety, and it means that you feel included, you feel accepted, you feel a sense of belonging. That's stage 1. Now, to your question, Aga, can you go to the other stages without that stage? And the answer is no, you cannot. You have to have a threshold level. Now, that's going to vary, right? There's no formula for it, but there has to be a threshold level of inclusion safety in stage 1 before you can engage in the vulnerable activities of the successive stages.
So I want us to underscore that for all the organizations where people might still feel like they need to raise a facade and basically pretend that they are someone else because potentially their sexuality or gender identification or social group belonging or identity simply are not accepted or are being looked down upon. So what you're saying is that until this person doesn't feel comfortable enough to show up at work authentically, they will not be able to grow and learn and fulfill their full potential. They will not be able to contribute as much as they would in other circumstances. And also they will not be able to help the organization improve. Is that basically how it works?
That's exactly right. So let me give you an example of why. So inclusion safety, as I said, it's stage 1, it's the foundation. So then we go to learner safety. Learner safety is stage 2. Learner safety means that you feel safe to engage in the learning process. Meaning what? Meaning asking questions, meaning giving and receiving feedback, experimenting, even making mistakes, without being embarrassed or marginalized or punished in some way. Now, let's say that you don't feel included. You don't feel stage 1, inclusion safety. What's that going to do to you? Well, what that's going to do to you is that environment means that your acts of vulnerability to be included are being punished. If that's the environment that you're in, that is going to trigger the pain centers of the brain. It's going to activate your self-censoring instinct.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, you're going to start saying and doing different things. That's going to thrust you into a defensive mode of performance. So now you're preoccupied with managing personal risk. You're preoccupied with self-preservation, with loss avoidance. If you're in that mode, let's make the connection now. If you're in that mode, what kind of learner are you?
Yep.
Are you learning at capacity? There's no way. You're not learning at capacity, because what we know about learning is that the intellectual and the emotional are connected. You cannot separate the thinking brain from the feeling brain. So you as a learner, you are cognitively impaired as a learner. If you feel marginalized and not included, your ability to learn has been compromised. So it's connected.
And that speaks immediately to all the systemic barriers that are in place still in so many countries all over the world, where because people are being marginalized, they do not have equal opportunities or cannot take advantage of the same opportunities in the same way. So even, I suppose, when a Black person gets exactly the same educational opportunities, if they are being marginalized, they will not be able to take advantage of these opportunities. And I think for a lot of people, they struggle to understand that. And so I think it's so important to talk about this, that actually until people feel like they are being accepted and they belong, they cannot fulfill their full potential, even given the same opportunities that others have, which is, by the way, not the case anyway. But it all starts from that first stage.
I think it does. And that's why that's the foundation. And by the way, so in our global survey research, 92% of people, of employees around the world, they said in the survey research, they said that inclusion was the first need that they wanted to satisfy. So we know that it comes first in the sequence. There's a sequence to satisfying basic human needs, and that comes first.
I can completely identify with that, just based on my personal experience as a kid, where I always felt I didn't belong. An introvert, highly functioning introvert now, I think, but still an introvert. And as a kid, I was really interested in reading, and I wanted to go on adventures and explore the world. And I didn't really find that peer group in the little town that I was growing up in. And so I can totally identify with that it is indeed the most important thing that a human being craves. And of course, having lived for decades now, I hear people say that again and again and again. So I'm not surprised that this is what has come out of your research, because it seems to be my empirical experience, my life experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the benefits of the 4 stages framework, Aga, is that you can verify it based on your own personal experience in life.
It's very intuitive. Mm-hmm.
It is. As I said, so stage 2 is learner safety. Think about what happens. And one of the statistics that I give in the book is that every 26 seconds, a student drops out of high school in the United States.
Every 26 seconds. Wow.
And that's tragic. But what's even more tragic is to understand that the vast majority of those students, they have the ability to do the academic work. So why are they dropping out? They're dropping out because they're emotionally bruised as learners. They don't have the support. They lose confidence. They fall behind, and then they call it quits.
Yeah.
So the real tragedy is, let's go back to, we said, psychological safety is an environment of rewarded vulnerability. they have been living and growing and learning, oftentimes in an environment of punished vulnerability. And there will be some who just have an internal locus of control, amazing confidence, and they will muscle through the fear and they will somehow get through the adversity, but most people will not. Most children in that environment, they will become casualties. And that's a great tragedy. So that's stage 2. Now, stage 3 is contributor safety. Now, you'll notice the sequence. Learn first, contribute second. So learning precedes contribution. If you haven't gained skills or knowledge or competency or experience, then you can't add value. That's pretty intuitive. Stage 3 means that you're given an opportunity to make a meaningful contribution, to do your part, to contribute and participate in the value creation process. Human beings have a deep-seated need to do that. There are 2 primary categories of identity formation. The first is your demographic and psychographic profile as a human being. It's who you are. The second category of identity formation is your ability to contribute. It's what you do. It reminds me, Aga, I was speaking with a group of women of color not too long ago. We had this marvelous conversation, and they said, Tim, we want to be valued for what we do.
Totally. I get that.
Not just who we are. And they were adamant about it.
You know, it's interesting because I was interviewing a woman, Yvette Pasqua, who is the chief product officer in a company, and she's queer, and she didn't want to talk about diversity and inclusion because she said, for me, it's way more important to throw that into a conversation that I'm a woman, I'm married to another woman, but be valued for what I do, not who I am. And so I want people to acknowledge that part of me. It's really important for me. I don't want to be just perceived as a queer woman in tech. That's not the point.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it was a really powerful moment for me because I realized, yeah, absolutely. I can only imagine how exhausting it must be to always be framed in a certain way, depending on this identity of who you are without being acknowledged for what you do as well.
Right. I think, Aga, though, when it comes to stage 3, I think we have to clarify something that's very important. So if we go back to stage 1, inclusion safety, my point of view is that inclusion safety is a human right.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that you earn. It's something that you are owed. It is, and I say this very deliberately, it is an entitlement. You're entitled to it. You're entitled to have other people invite you into their society based on your humanity. So then when we include each other, it's an act of prejudgment based on your humanity. In other words, I don't need to think about it in advance. It's not an act of judgment based on my opinion of your worthiness. It's an act of prejudgment based on your inherent worth. Now let's keep going though. If we go all the way to stage 3, and here's the clarification that I wanted to give. Stage 3 is contributor safety. It's not a human right. Contributor safety, you have entered the performance zone by the time you get to stage 3. Humans want autonomy. They want an appropriate level of autonomy because autonomy allows them to express themselves, to be creative, to take ownership, to have independence, to be self-directed. And humans want that. But if you're in an organization, in a professional setting, you're not entitled to that.
Thanks for making that clarification.
You have to earn that. You have to deliver the results. So the social exchange, when you get to stage 3, is that the team, the organization will grant you a measure of autonomy with guidance and with support in exchange for what? In exchange for results. If you don't deliver the results, if there's not a track record of performance, then the amount of autonomy that you're given will be very small. And that is as it should be, because we're all accountable. So this is very important. One of the misconceptions about psychological safety is that it is a shield from accountability.
Yeah.
It's not. They think they have diplomatic immunity from accountability because, we have psychological safety now. We value our humanity. And I want to say to them, yes, we do. And you're also accountable for performance.
I love that. And it's such an important point to make. And I wonder whether you see this equally true in the final stage, the challenger safety stage, because what I hear very often from senior leadership teams who try to be with just on try, so they try, not necessarily succeed in being more inclusive in terms of bringing younger team members into the meetings and engaging them and listening to their ideas. But then they often say, well, people will come in and challenge ideas without having done their homework. So, without facts, without preparation, just saying, I disagree with that. So is it a right to challenge, or is it also something that we need to win over, our ability to, that space to challenge?
It's a combination. Do you have a fundamental right to challenge the status quo? I think you do. But do you have a right to be heard? Do you have a right for people to take very seriously what you're saying? You're going to have to earn that part based on the merit of what you're saying. So when we get to stage 4, challenger safety, let's just clarify. What it means is that you feel safe to challenge the status quo. And I think this is where we can provide the clarification, Aga, without retaliation, without retribution, without jeopardizing your career, without putting your career on the line. This is the important part. So even if you're new, I think you should have the right to be able to challenge the status quo without fear of retaliation.
Can I share a story here?
Yeah.
So now as a very young and eager consultant, I joined a very famous consultancy. I was thrilled and incredibly honored to be part of that team, really eager to do anything to help. And I remember literally carrying people's bags to various workshops, and they were so impressive to me. And so I was working with this woman, obviously not going to name any names, and I really hugely admired her for her expertise and what she was doing. And she was wonderful enough to ask me for feedback after a workshop. We were co-delivering, co-facilitating that workshop. So first she gave me feedback, and then she said, well, I'd love to hear what you thought. No one gives me feedback anymore. I would love to hear what you thought. And so I knew this in theory because we were teaching this to others, the famous sandwich method. So I said what she was incredible and amazing at, and what I really loved and what I appreciated about how she did things. And then I gave her a tiny little pointer in the middle and then closed again with something positive. And she did hear that middle part better than I thought she would, because what happened was, and then I go back to the office. Let's tell this part of the story. And my friends, my colleagues asked me how it went, and I'm super excited. I'm like, yeah, it was amazing. And she even asked me for feedback, and they kind of froze. And I remember my colleague asking me, and what did you do? And I said, well, I told her one thing, like she was turning her back basically to one part of the room all the time and speaking to the side where the CEO was sitting. And I pointed that out stupidly, obviously. When my colleague heard what I did, she was like, fuck, you shouldn't have done that. You will never work with her again. And it was true. So for 6 months, she never reached out to me to work with her on a project again. So this happens in organizations all the time. It really is risky.
Right. So let's talk about the consequences of that on both sides. If you experience punished vulnerability for that vulnerable behavior, Aga, then you will be neutralized in the future to do that again. So the organization will be deprived of your feedback. So we're not going to get that. We're going to get compliance instead of creative abrasion.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're going to get. We're not going to get the constructive dissent. We're not going to get the divergent thinking. We're not going to get the tolerance for candor that we need. The organizations desperately need that. Otherwise, they will suffer the pains of isolation and insulation. And eventually, the leaders, if they act like that in the organization, will become willfully blind.
Yeah. And then we have Volkswagen and Wells Fargo and all this. Yeah.
Exactly. That's right. So we will enter eventually a state of willful blindness. So think about how it deprives the organization. Think about what it does to you to neutralize your initiative and that courageous behavior. Now think about what it does to her. She can't take the feedback because she won't let go of her ego defense mechanisms. She won't let go of her pride of authorship. And so she will be stunted in her growth because she is unwilling to receive the feedback. She's unwilling to process that and then incorporate that. And so her performance, her development, her growth slows down. So if you look at the unintended consequences of shutting people down and not allowing people to challenge the status quo,
it's enormous, yeah.
It's incredible. Now, here's another thing to point out. Stage 4 challenger safety is where we innovate. This is the domain, this is the realm of innovation. Innovation, by its very nature, is disruptive of the status quo. It requires that we challenge the status quo. It undermines the status quo. And so the raw material for innovation is intellectual friction. We need high levels of intellectual friction in order to solve difficult problems, in order to create new solutions, in order to make breakthroughs, in order to innovate. You can't innovate if people aren't challenging the status quo. So the enemy of innovation is the homogenization of thought. It's an echo chamber. The last thing you need is an echo chamber.
Absolutely. So I guess it's entirely clear to me, and I think to everyone who's listening to our conversation, Tim, what's the cost of the lack of psychological safety. And I know from my work with various organizations that they are very committed to creating psychological safety. And the biggest barrier that I can see at the moment is that for many companies, they're not entirely clear, where do you start creating psychological safety? And what are the practical things that you can do to start moving in the right direction? So my question to you is, where would you start creating psychological safety? And I think particularly in an organization where people are not trusted to do what's right, where they don't have the autonomy to do their job. And the reason I'm asking about this specific scenario is that it's quite common. So unfortunately, that approach of heroic leadership and leaders who are controlling, et cetera, it's still very, very common. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What should be the first steps companies should be thinking of taking?
Right. I advocate an approach where the members of a team or organization jump right into behavior. The traditional approach is that we begin by increasing understanding and awareness. And then there's this operating assumption that if we all understand more about where we are and where we need to go, that we will eventually cross a threshold of conviction And we will believe that, yes, this is where we need to go, and this is what we need to do, and this is how I need to change. And I'll cross that threshold of conviction, and then I will start to behave differently.
I love the way you put it, and I'm smiling now because it's so true. So true.
So what I'm saying is, if you take that approach, that's the traditional approach. If you take that approach, plan on waiting a long time for people's hearts to change, because that's not the way that it works. And so what we say is, let's just begin with inclusion safety, which is the foundation. So first of all, where do you start? You start with stage one, inclusion safety. That's the foundation. How do you start? You start by jumping into behaviors, because the transformation, we can talk about organizational transformation or team transformation, and we use these institutional terms and systems level terms. That's largely an illusion. Where does it happen? It happens on the ground at an individual level. It happens through a journey of self-discovery. So what does that mean? That means that the individual needs to start applying, practicing, modeling some new behaviors. What happens then is those new behaviors, if they're practiced consistently, they will generate confirming evidence that what you're doing works and it's the right thing to do. So it's that process of self-discovery. Let me give you an example. So I've created what's called the Behavioral Guide, which is a companion to the book. And it is the practical application of each of the 4 stages based on very concrete behaviors.
How can we get hold of it? Is it available?
Yeah, we can make that available to you.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I can send it to you. So I'll give you an example. And for each stage, there are something like 35 very specific behaviors associated with the stage. So as an example, let's go to stage 2. Stage 2 is learner safety. Here's a concrete example from the behavioral guide. In this case, this would be for a team leader or for a manager. And the behavior is this: ask for help from someone of lower status in a public forum.
I love it.
It's very concrete. And it sends out unmistakable signals about your learning disposition, about your attitude, about your humility to learn together, about your desire to collaborate. It's very specific. Another one let's go to stage 4, challenger safety. And this one I worked on with an executive, and it was really quite remarkable. One of the behaviors in the behavioral guide is weigh in last in meetings if you hold positional power. So I worked with one executive, and he was a very dominant type personality. Really a wonderful gentleman in many ways, but he would come into a meeting, whether it was face-to-face or virtual, and he would commandeer the meeting. He would take over. He would dominate. He was well-intentioned, but his behavior would ice the meeting. He would trigger their self-censoring instincts. They would withdraw. They would retreat. They would recoil, which is completely predictable. And I said, Keith, so we're going to work on this behavior. He said, okay, yeah. I said, are you willing to try it and do it and really, really work hard at it? He said, yeah, I'll do it. So he did. At first, nothing happened, because when there's a sudden change of behavior, people don't buy it. But after a few days and then into a few weeks, he started to notice changes in the patterns of interaction. So he started asking more questions. He wouldn't jump in with statements or points of view. And he started to draw out the members of the team. They started to engage more. Their levels of ideation went to another level. Their levels of of candor, the quality of their collaboration. The ideas started to collide and rub against each other. So after a few weeks, based on evidence, through self-discovery, he could literally see that he was able to draw out the team, that their patterns of interaction had changed, the terms of engagement had changed, and the quality of the outputs were better. So you ask how? Well, the roadmap, the journey is to begin with stage one, inclusion safety, identify just a few concrete behaviors that you need to work on, you can do better at.
Yeah.
And if every member of the team does that, the prevailing norms on that team cannot stay the same. It's impossible. They will shift.
And this is exactly what I see in my work. And we're so fully aligned around this approach because I've noticed that the traditional approach to transformation or change doesn't really work, predominantly because it lacks two things. One is focus that you've just talked about. So we really need to be clear what exactly we should be doing differently. But even before that, I think we often fail to identify the right entry point. I call it the growing edge, which is basically this thing that is going to pave the way to other changes. So in your model, this is inclusion safety because that's the only way to get to stage 2 and then to stage 3 and so on. And indeed, I think that until people have a lived experience of this different behavior producing desired results,
Yes.
no matter how much we try to sell it, nothing's going to change. But the moment you have a lived experience and it's a collective experience, this is when culture starts to shift.
That's right. As I like to say, Aga, you can change my mind with data, but you can only change my heart with experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. And I can't wait to share your guide with our listeners. This is going to be such an incredibly valuable thing for them to dig into. I'm mindful of the time. I want to have time for the final section of our show, which is called Rapid Fire Questions.
Rapid fire. Oh boy.
You've listened, right, to a couple of episodes, so you know what I'll ask you to do. 5 questions. We're going to try to get your answers in under 2 minutes to all 5 of these questions.
Okay. I'm going to buckle up here, Aga.
Yes, buckle up, please. Take a sip of water and off we go. So tell me about the signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul, a transformation as you referred to it.
Sure. So you can tell if you go into any team, and whether it's virtual, hybrid, face-to-face, whatever the configuration is, if you spend 15 minutes with any group of individuals, you pay attention to 2 things. Number 1, acts of vulnerability that the members of the team are engaging in. And number 2, the responses to those acts of vulnerability. That's where you can tell the overall health of a social collective. So if people are silent, if they're not engaging in those acts of vulnerability, it's a dead giveaway. If they are, then you simply watch to see what happens next. Will those acts of vulnerability be rewarded or punished? Or is it a mixture? Is it a combination of the two? So that's the way that you can assess and calibrate where a team is, because the psychological safety is the central indicator of the overall health and strength of the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. What are the companies that you admire for their culture because they have a lot of psychological safety?
Well, it's kind of customary for people to list, all the cliche companies, but I don't know that those are based on secondhand accounts. So I can only really comment on that, Aga, based on the companies that we work with and where I see real progress. So right now, I'd mention the World Bank in some areas. I'd mention the Global Fund out of Switzerland. I'd mention recently I was in Sao Paulo with Coca-Cola Brazil. I was incredibly impressed. I was blown away.
What blew you away? We're probably going to exceed our 2 minutes now, but I'm curious.
we were in a retreat with the CEO and his team, and the level of candor and openness and stage 4 challenger safety was amazing. It was amazing.
Wow.
You could see it. It's in the room. You can't fake that. You can't fake that. When other members of the team are challenging the status quo and you have this incredibly healthy debate and they really are debating issues on their merits, that's real. You can't fake that.
No, you
So
can't.
that was just a recent experience where I had a big smile. That was amazing.
That's nice. Are there any books that you would recommend people read? Your book, for sure. That's that's my answer to this question.
Yeah, please. I hope so. I don't read a lot of business books, which maybe sound a little strange. But so as it relates to stage 1 inclusion safety, Aga, I'll recommend a book called Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele.
I've never heard of it.
And Claude Steele is a social psychologist. He was a long time at Stanford, and then he was at Berkeley, he was at Columbia. He's an African-American social psychologist, and he is a pioneer in what is called stereotype threat theory. And I think that book is absolutely fantastic, and it helps us understand some of the reasons that we don't get to stage 1 inclusion safety and are able to sustain that condition. I would recommend that one.
Amazing. Final question. What is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
So I would say one thing, Aga: model and reward acts of vulnerability. That is the central mechanism for cultural transformation. Just focus on that. You yourself model and reward acts of vulnerability. That would be my answer.
Love it. So if our listeners want to learn more about you, about what you do, what are the best online places to go to?
Well, I would invite them to come to our website, leaderfactor.com. And then also just reach out on LinkedIn, Timothy R. Clark on LinkedIn. I think those are probably the best couple of places to get in touch, and love to hear from you, any of your listeners.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you for the work that you are doing. I really appreciate what you do. We need this. We need a lot more psychological safety in the world. So I am so grateful for everything that you've done in this field.
Well, Aga, thank you. And thank you for what you're doing in the field of culture. And thank you for helping us cross-pollinate the way that you are. I think it's marvelous.
Thank you, Tim. I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Production manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. Tim and I hope that you will take the ideas that resonated and experiment with them in your own life and in your company. And if you'd like an opportunity to interact with Tim and with other guests in live interactive sessions where you can learn more on the topic, this is just one of the many benefits you would enjoy if you were a member of the CultureBrained community. So CultureBrained is one-of-a-kind global community for culture leaders who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. If you are in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, you'd probably feel right at home in our community. It's a diverse group of culture leaders from Fortune 100 companies to tiny startups who are on a rapid growth trajectory. But what brings us together is a passion for cultivating a healthy culture at scale. And we are guided by our values of being bold, being kind, and being curious. And we'd love for you to join if it feels like the right fit for you. You can learn more at tiny.one/CultureBrained. You'll find the link in the show notes. Now, I want to give you a quick preview of the upcoming episode. So my next guest develops groundbreaking natural language understanding for HR tech at MIT. And he measurably improves cultures by understanding what employees say about their organization, but also about one another. And in this short snippet, Charlie Sal reveals the only 2 questions we should be asking to understand our company culture. So enjoy the preview and tune in 2 weeks from now to hear the full interview.
Our approach is we feel a better way of measuring culture is to ask basically 2 questions, and crucially, they're open-ended questions. So we just ask basically what is working well here and what is not working so well here, what needs to be improved. And instead of sort of telling the employee what to say with these 1 to 10 point questions where you decide the topic, you listen to what they have to say and you let them surface the topic. So you see the issues they raise, you listen to how frequently different issues are raised, and how favorably people are talking about them. And then if you get this free text response, you get just a level of magnitude richer response than from a 1 to 10 point answer. Natural language is just much richer than numbers. You can understand exactly what problems they're identifying at the phrase level. We kind of like to think of it as the difference between getting a yes or a no answer from someone and having sort of an in-depth conversation with them.
Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on any podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you want to receive our weekly insights on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: tinyurl.com/Agabayer. That's tinyurl.com/AGABAJER. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. And finally, the entire Culture Lab team and our guests, we are going to continue exploring how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, and how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing. So, what do you want to hear about next? What matters to you? Email us at lindsay@agabayer.com and let us know.